Indeed, times are hard when fall falls, the election is coming. We have lost some loved ones in our midst. And it's very hard for Jesus's day when he speaks this parable. Now, there are several more verses to this parable I will not be including for a couple of reasons I will not go into, other than to say that the absentee landowner in this parable is not God, as I understand God. And the heir, the son who was killed here, knowing that Jesus knew that his crucifixion was impending, I don't believe when he originally told this parable, he meant that to be him. And I will get into that in the message. But let us now hear the parable of what's sometimes called the wicked tenants, though truly there's plenty of violence to go on all around. Here are the good news. Jesus said, and he was speaking to the chief priest and the elders, not his disciples, but to the chief priest and the elders in Jerusalem. Jesus said, listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went off to another country. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, they will respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance. So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They, the chief priest and the elders, said to him, he will put those wretches to a miserable death and leave the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time. Ah, the language of violence, breeding violence, breeding violence, breeding violence. Would you pray with me? Oh God, you know and experience all our pain. Your heart is the first of all hearts to break. And we hear today of hearts breaking, strange, bitter fruit in our scripture today. The bitter fruit of wantonness and caprice that bespeaks the violence convulsing our land. Of viruses that will continue to fester November 3rd and beyond. Where, oh, where can we find our rest? In thee, but in thee. Now may the words of our mouths, may they prick my mouth, prick the grapevines of our hearts, to bear bountiful, nourishing fruit in all our lives, O Christ, for you are our vine, and we your branches. Amen. And the slide you see before you, a framed photograph, is hanging on the wall of our Delray 12-step clubhouse in our church. It's home to the Delray Club when it's open, and it is not now, to over 50 weekly 12-step meetings. They're all meeting on Zoom right now, or at least 47 of them I know. 3 are meeting outdoors in our property, safely apart. And they serve up to 200 seekers of sobriety each day there. This is the panoramic photo, as you can see, of an international AA convention. It's one of 3 photos of different conventions gifted to Delray when they relocated to our church in 2012. We gave these photos to them. And as you can see, this is one from 1995 in San Diego. I was 1 year sober at that time, and I participated in that convention. And Claire, you can remove the slide as I tell the story now about living in Oklahoma. Living in Oklahoma then, I traveled to that convention via chartered bus as part of an entourage of nearly 40 stark raving sober alcoholics from Oklahoma. We departed from the capital, Oklahoma City, in the shadow of what had been the federal building, bombed out less than 3 months prior. Again, this is 1995. But ours was a journey of redemption, a journey from Oklahoma to California by bus. Does that sound historically familiar? Oklahoma to California? So with the Dust Bowl in mind, our overland band christened this trip The Wrath of Grapes, California or Bust. The Wrath of Grapes. It was a great wordplay for our journey. And it's a great metaphor for us today, a metaphor befitting the lived condition of Jesus's audience in their troubled imperial times, the wrath of grapes. In this fourth consecutive Sunday of Vineyard Parables, Jesus recreates what the wrath of grapes is all about. The sour grapes of violence in his time and ours, bitter fruit, emerging from the soil of idolatry and oppression, rife in empires Roman and American. This is a story saturated with human tragedy, framed by the age-old myth that violence from one party can redeem the violence from the other. It's a story I believe Jesus told to describe what he stood against in his ministry, the cycle of violence, beginning with the Roman absentee landowner in this story, and all the absentee landowners that continued with bloody and failed Jewish uprisings against Rome, this cycle. Uprisings convulsing into a civil war head at the time of Matthew's writing. I agree with those scholars who do not believe that the retributive vineyard owner is a stand-in for God here. And I agree with those who do not understand Jesus to be the landowner's heir, the son. It's positioned in Matthew's gospel conveniently near his crucifixion, but I do not believe that's the way Jesus originally intended this. Those interpretations were added later in the verses to follow to tamp down and allegorize the power of the story. And yet those interpretations miss the point, I think. For how could Jesus portray to us a vindictive God and his God and ours as an absentee landowner? This is not the God who runs to welcome the prodigal home, the searcher for the lost sheep, the sower who broadcasts seed where he or she may. This is not Jesus's ever-present and loving deity, presented in stark contrast to the Roman Stoic gods of apatheia, the God that we recognize in our prayer of confession today. Instead, as Jesus's debt-enslaved audience well knew, the vineyard owner represents one of countless Roman land-grabbing elites who have, quote unquote, added jobs to the economy, have then overburdened their labor, and have long departed from the Palestinian scene to play the Roman market. And then to have the gall in this story to insist that their debt slaves maintain for them the coercive peace. Ah, the institutional violence we rarely talk about. These absentee oppressors, aliens to all that is just and all that is good. And in this tragic tale, as their violence is offered, their violence is returned in the bloody revolt of the Jewish guerrilla zealots roaming the land all around, slaughtering everyone the landowner sends, his slaves, more of his slaves, and finally his son. The vineyard owner, of course, responds in kind. Violence breeding violence, breeding violence. All playing out the canard that we all live by deep down, that sorrows Jesus and should sorrow us, that violence can somehow redeem other violence. Is there no end to the cycle of violence? Is there no balm in Gilead? Enter Jesus. Enter the church. And enter our celebration today of a communion that testifies to a hard-won justice, abundance for the have-nots, a justice we can only effect in a non-violent, that is, an inclusive way. Not through non-inclusive taunts of an oppressor president on the one hand, and not through calls to stand back and stand by for the uprising by tenants protecting the slaves on the other. Truly, the tenants protecting the haves on the other. No, Jesus's is a deep peace that nevertheless stands its ground, that does not tolerate idolatry or cooperate with oppression, and refuses all along to become belligerent in the process. His response, our response, instead, is a table-making peace where everyone can eat, everyone can drink, everyone can be slaked and fed, knowing that that all-out commitment to nonviolent inclusion, it will lead to institutional instability, knowing that that commitment will lead to crucifying consequences. Yes, it will. Nonviolent, loving resistance to injustice, it will lead to harsh consequences. Nonviolent, loving resistance to injustice. Love and justice, they cannot exist apart. Producing not the bitter fruit of violence, redeeming violence, but producing a bountiful crop for all to eat as equals at the table of the Lord. And that includes today's tenants. And yes, it includes today's enslaved in our world. We are to be like those first century Christians. We are expected to be like those first century Christians, people of love for even the oppressor and people of resistance to oppression of any kind. Few people I knew lived nonviolent, if not loving resistance to injustice better than our beloved Dorothy McDowell. When Dot was married to her husband Herschel in 1956, many of you saw their wedding picture earlier. It was to be a double wedding with her brother and his betrothed. And yet, just a week before their ceremonies, her brother found himself on the wrong side of their South Carolina town, as she put it. The white toughs, she called them, ran him off the road. He died in his car. Many persons, like our debt-enslaved tenants today in the story, many persons would try and redeem that violence in their lives through their own violent measures, not Dot. Even to the point that she and Herschel bought a home in Bethesda in the 60s, then more than ever, a white enclave of DC. Even to the point of becoming the second Black family to join a church of nearly 1,000 white folk in 1971. Even to the point of finding her own place at the deacon's table at the session table in our church when no place had been set for her. And yet Dot saw it. And yet Dot took it. So my dear white and or wealthier friends, what seats are yet visible to you round our World Communion table today? Even midst our blindness, our lack of vision, those seats Jesus has prepared already, they can still be found by us. But first, we might need to allow them to be found by others and accept that. First, we must refuse to harvest the bitter fruit of our story today. First, that bitter fruit, that violence can somehow redeem violence, that some are in and some are out. And then we must trust the Prince of Peace and the bountiful crop of justice he demands, consequences to be damned. Those seats invisible to us are there. They're more than just for Elijah. Those seats are there, but there is not much time in our land to find them. Witness Tuesday's debate. No surprise, it was violent. Simply reflecting our world torn asunder. Promising more crucifixions, present, president, or no. Is there much time left in our land? I invite us not to place too much hope in our nation and our addiction to peace through victory when Jesus calls us instead to effect peace through justice. Jesus's and Matthew's church did not put their hopes in Roman exceptionalism. Why then should we? Is there much time left in our land? And the bigger picture, of course, in our world with global warming. Well, ultimately about our own nation, that is not the question of our Jesus. His question is, how are you going to follow me? For I do not believe that we can two-time Jesus by pledging allegiance to our crumbling empire around us. Our crumbling empire, the wrath of grapes, bitter fruit abounding, befitting few communion tables of God's bountiful crop, of indiscriminate love, and what is truly radical, distributing God's justice, God's enoughness for all. That's God's table of enough, where Jesus declares what no addicts to violence could ever declare, that crucifixions, though inevitable, be not necessary anymore. Thanks be to God for that good news. Amen.